I'm Arthur Malman, your host for GGG Insights, and welcome to another in our series of the future of East Hampton, the problems, the challenges, the opportunities. During this series, we have a wide range of East Hampton residents, some involved in government, some political, some students, some activists, and some just normal people, farmers, construction people, and so forth. Today we're having the second segment with David Gruber, who was with us before and started to talk about some of the ways in which government as an institution doesn't work right in East Hampton and should be improved in order to deliver better services more effectively to people and operate. David, why don't you give people a bit of your background and maybe just a couple of minute reprise on our prior show in case you didn't catch it.
Thank you, Arthur. So I've been in town since 1987, which means I'm not even an honorary Bonnaker. You know, that's way too short. But I've lived most of my adult life in East Hampton. I've done a number of things in town. I ran for supervisor in 2001, lost by a whisker. Mm-hmm. Then I was the chair of
Is that why you have whiskers now? You want to
Yes,
make sure
that is why.
You won't move by
to remind me of my failures.
Okay.
I can get up every morning and be reminded. Then I was chair of the East Hampton Town Democratic Committee for several years, and during that period and after have worked behind the scenes for Democratic political campaigns in town with some notable success. As really the chief author of the Democrats' political strategy and campaign literature. More recently, am I allowed to say this? I'm now running for a seat on the town board.
As a disclosure item. That's not a hype
no,
item,
no,
I think.
No, it's not advertising. I'm just trying to be honest. Mm-hmm. With a Democratic Party primary upcoming on Thursday, September 13th. Right. And my personal motivation from sort of coming out from behind the curtain and stepping back onto the open political stage has been my growing frustration about things that have been long promised to the community and just aren't getting done. Mm-hmm. That includes affordable housing, where we set a goal of 1,300 units in the comprehensive plan of 15, 16 years ago. At current rates, it's going to take 200 to 300 years to meet that target.
Everybody's living longer.
Yeah,
that won't be a problem.
Yes.
We'll all be alive, unfortunately.
You know, we have had a local waterfront revitalization plan, which is a brilliant document, mostly drafted by Ramesh Das, but is a policy guidance, not a concrete plan for what to do. And we're facing the growing threat of erosion, and we don't have a concrete plan of how we're going to respond to that. The example I like to give is that we talk about retreat from the beach, but the buildings that are very close to the beach are not going to pick themselves up and walk away. We have to do some things. Somebody has to do something if that's going to happen. Who, what, when, how's it paid for, who pays for it, over what time frame. We need to be concrete about that. We've had a discussion for decades now about the need to protect water quality, and yet water quality is declining. A year or so ago, we adopted a provision or referendum to use some CPF money, Community Preservation Fund money, for water quality projects, but we don't really understand how we can spend that money effectively so that we get the outcome we want.
Well, David, I think also people think that there's probably $5 million a year that comes out of the CPF for water quality. Mm-hmm. And some of the estimates that I've seen for people upgrading their private systems, community systems, are $500 million. Oh, it doesn't have to be spent in the next 24 hours, but 5 million versus 500. Maybe it's 400, maybe it's 300 is, and I don't want to use a bad metaphor for water, but it's a drop in the bucket. So that's not going to really.
That was very good, Arthur.
It's not.
Bravo.
It's not going to hit the mark.
It's a little bit of the side of what I wanted to talk about, but it's a good concrete example. So let's talk about that. We have some funding available, but if we don't have a concrete understanding of what is physically required to address our growing problem, there's a good chance that all the money we have will be misspent. For example, nitrogen loading on the system, where our own waste is the source of nitrogen, is a big concern. So the concrete question is, okay, what is the load that we place on our water? What is the acceptable quantity that the physical water supply can absorb in a given year without deteriorating? What's the gap? I assume there's a gap. And what physical systems are needed in order to address that gap? That's where your figure of, what could be a couple $100 million comes in if we're going to do that on a town-wide basis. Now, if we don't spend the money we have wisely, we could easily find that we've spent it and we have no different outcome than we have today. Personally, not only do we need to know concretely what physically is required to get where we want to go, but my preference would be to spend the money we have to ensure that people who don't have the means to put in systems that may be required can afford to do so. So rather than say, okay, this project, that other project, without achieving anything, I think we need to know globally what's required, and then we need to make provisions so that if people based on their means need subsidies, we can provide those.
But isn't that what the town's doing already, David? That if I live in a high or a zone close to the water, a water body, and I have limited means, can't I get some money to upgrade my system?
I believe that's the case, but the decision that it's about proximity to the water may not be the right one. If in fact, as I suspect, that over a period of 5 to 10 years, we're going to have to require everybody in the town of East Hampton to have a nitrogen system in order to solve this problem, then we have to consider how that gets paid for. I don't think it's an excessive burden for somebody who's got a very valuable home. It could be a very excessive burden for somebody who doesn't. I would prefer to know where we're going and use the public funds we have available to ensure that everybody can afford to put in these systems, as opposed to saying, oh, that's a nice project, we'll give some money to that, that's a nice project. It's haphazard. And I think there's a real risk that with a haphazard approach, we'll spend the money, we won't get the outcome that we want, and in effect, we'll be stuck doing it all over again. Or we'll give the money to the wrong things, and then everybody else is going to have to pick up the rest of the tab.
Well, how would you, for this project or retreat from the ocean, how would you have government operate differently than the way it's operating now?
Well, the things that we discussed last time were that there are technical issues that I think the town board is ill-equipped to address. We have issues everywhere from beach hydrology to fish ecology to water quality to housing. We've got a very big portfolio of unaddressed problems in the town. I think it's essentially impossible that any 5 people who get elected to the town board would have the kind of experience or expertise to understand what to do about those things. That by itself is not such a big problem because we can't expect them ever to have that expertise. It's knowing what to do about it. And we talked about this too, that if you hire experts, which is typically the approach that the town takes, and you've hired them and I've hired them, and you know that if you don't supervise them closely, if you're not a knowledgeable client, you're going to get usually a useless outcome.
A useless, more expensive than you thought report.
Right.
late that then gathers dust.
Yeah.
As somebody gets the next report. One of the things that's been frustrating to me working on the airport is so many times we say, well, we need a study of X, and we go out and we get the study of X, only to find that 20 years ago, this study of X was done, but nobody remembers that it was done, and if they remember it, they can't find it. It's just waste upon waste upon waste.
So, I mean, my answer to that problem is that we are fortunate in East Hampton that we have extraordinary human resources here. Because we are proximate to New York City and we have second homeowners here, people who've moved here, as well as a huge skill set from people who are, I mean, I talked to a guy, I was at a barbecue at the American Legion, And I started talking to the guy sitting at the table with me, and he's a fish biologist, works for National Marine Fisheries Service, lives in Springs, grew up here, studied at Southampton College. We have a lot of very capable people in this town, and we don't use their talents the way we can. I believe that many members of this community with expertise, if they were asked to participate in an active way in solving these problems, as you and I do, as members of the Airport Management Advisory Committee, would be happy to devote their time. They don't want to waste their time. If they don't feel
that's
that
the
it's...
other, that's the other
Yeah.
part of the problem.
Yeah, if they don't feel that what they're doing is going to be useful and effective, they've got plenty of other things to do. But we have, on any subject, people here who can participate usefully and can contribute and would be glad to do so. So I think the whole process has to be opened up, and the community needs to be invited to participate actively in order to get the kind of technical outcomes we need. But there's another aspect to that that we didn't talk about, and that's sort of the political side of it. One of the reasons I think that the town board is often incapable of moving forward is political timidity. Politicians hate being criticized. I mean, they really hate it. And if you do things that are bold enough to address some significant problems, you're going to get criticized. And they don't want to be criticized. And they're afraid, too often afraid, that they'll be punished for being open and trying to solve these problems. And, you know, they may be right. I think that the stakeholders, no matter what the issue, stakeholders, the people who have an interest on all sides, need to be invited to participate actively, not just for their technical expertise, but because it's an opportunity for the people who have an interest to try to work out solutions. And if they work out a solution, or even most of a solution, the chances that it will be politically sustainable in the community go way up. The chance that the town board will be criticized for adopting that solution that's already acceptable to the people with a stake, the stakeholders, goes way up. I mean, it reduces their political risk. I think that I don't see any other way we're going to kind of get out of the dead end that we're stuck in, where the problems that are long-term critical issues remain unsolved because we're kind of backed into a corner. I think in all cases, a far more open process that invites and encourages public participation is the way to go. And you and I have some experience with
we've had experience. I was just going to say, David, when we set up the Airport Management Advisory Committee, we specifically wanted and got 3 people who were aviation oriented, 100%.
Yeah.
And we got 3 people who were anti-noise oriented, 100%. And then we got 3 other people who were not committed to either side. But what's been amazing to me, and very much your point, so many of the important improvements at the airport have been adopted unanimously by the members of the committee. The anti-noise people voted for a new fuel farm. The anti-noise people voted for a fence around, new fence around the airport. You know, I could keep on listing these things. Now, sometimes the committee votes for something 100%, and for one reason or another, the town doesn't do it. But when you, just like you said, when you get a good example, another good example was hangars. Nobody ever wanted to build new hangars at the airport because they were afraid it would attract more airplanes. Well, it doesn't attract more airplanes making more noise. Nobody's going to fly to East Hampton because they have a hangar. They're going to fly to East Hampton and go to a dinner party. And so why not get the revenue in? I mean, again, shocking to the aviation interests that the anti-noise people were in favor of that, and there were things we did that was shocking to the anti-noise people that the aviation people were in favor of, and it's just precisely what you're talking about.
Well, look, we've been at it for 3 years,
3 or 4 years
I think,
now,
at least, and you know, the airport has been one of the most bitterly fought and longest
Fine.
Longest controversies, I mean, in the town. It goes back, it's approaching 40 years. It goes back to the early 80s that this first became a controversial issue. Understandably, for that reason, in the early goings, it was pretty slow going. There was a lot of distrust, suspicion that people were not really willing to engage the interests of the other side. And it's not like it's all love and light at this
No, sure,
point.
we have
I
lots
mean,
of arguments both ways.
But I think over time, the tone has changed markedly. I think that there is mutual regard for the interests of the other side. And I think we've been able to work out in solutions in important cases. I'm one of the members, as you described, from the community side concerned about noise. But my commitment has been to do the things that facilitate operation of the airport if they are not, if they don't increase traffic or
Traffic, what it's all
operations.
about, right.
The noise is due to traffic. As long as it's not going to increase traffic, I think we should try to accommodate people with interests on the other side. The fuel farm is a good example. People who are flying to East Hampton, they don't care how big the fuel farm is. That affects the people who operate at the airport and how many deliveries and how often they have to take deliveries of fuel. It's of no relevance or importance to the guy who flies in how big the tank is at the airport.
Yeah, and also as a practical matter, we had an old fuel farm sitting on top of a sole source aquifer, and nobody really had paid too much attention to it because it had deteriorated over 25 years or so.
Yeah, so we were all concerned to get those underground tanks removed, to remove any threat to the aquifer, and agreeing to a larger size that has no effect on operations was, to my mind, a very reasonable way to achieve an accommodation. The other example I've used recently is deep water wind, which is a controversial subject right now in town. You have a community that's justly and properly concerned, as I am, about the necessity of renewable energy, of weaning ourselves from fossil fuels. But we also have people who earn their living fishing in Montauk who I think have justifiable concern that this project might affect their livelihood, that there may be impacts on the fisheries. So on the one hand, we've got Gordian Rocky, who is very expert in renewable energy. On the other hand, we have Bonnie Brady, who lives in Montauk, is the executive director of the Long Island Commercial Fishing Association. These are two of the brightest, most articulate
Both of them are very
people I know in East Hampton who are absolutely committed to the well-being of the town. I can't imagine that if they, together with other people, had been invited to work out a solution that would be acceptable to both of them, that would make a way forward for renewable energy while protecting the fishing community. I can't believe they couldn't walk out of the room with something where they would both say, this is fine for us. If we do it this way.
It's not 100%, but
This works
good.
for me. I don't know why we don't do that. I mean, we just don't. What happens is people have to get before the town board and plead. One side gets up and pleads its case, and the other side gets up and pleads its case. It actually makes things worse in terms of some kind of civic harmony. What happens is that everybody is induced to raise the decibel level, the noise level of what they're saying to the town board. And so the town board is operating like an applause meter. It's who's getting the bigger applause and making the most noise. That's not the way to make these kind of decisions. And it puts people in a terribly frustrating and I think demeaning position of having to plead with, 5 people who someone described as a Politburo. So I think there's a better way to do this that actually reduces the decibel level and the intensity of disputes, that moves people towards achieving compromises that they can live with, and in the process creates a much better community. I mean, if people start to listen to other people and say, look, okay, I'm not the only one in East Hampton. I'm not the only person here. Other people have legitimate interests that are different from mine, and I cannot expect to have it all my way, I think we end up with a stronger community to boot. Now,
David, just following up, I'm just
Sure.
sort of thinking about, it's fresh in all of our minds, Deepwater Wind. And when that was, it was presented as this project, here it is, boom. And the only change, I think, from the initial presentation to what's on the table now, almost a year later, is at first the cable was going to come up on the bay side, and now it's going to go up from the ocean side. But other than that, and maybe there's been some change in the composition of the community benefits package, but there really
which is
hasn't-
just money. I
it's
mean,
just a few bucks.
you know.
And it sounds like it's $8 million, it's a few bucks, but this is a $1 billion project.
yeah, it's a drop in the bucket.
A drop in the
as you
bucket. Good.
say.
I don't know where you got
Yeah,
that phrase,
it
but
popped into my head. I've heard it
it's-
somewhere
yeah,
before.
yeah.
You know, the $8 million of something called community benefits, it's sort of a polite term. It's just money. And, you know, that $8 million amounts to $25 a year per East Hampton household. So it is not
A major issue.
a major sum of money.
You know, I think one of the issues that's still remaining, I know we've been very active trying to get people to focus on it. When I say people,
Yeah.
Deepwater Wind to focus on it, is if Joe Fisherman goes out, snags his net on something, be it the cable or whatever, then he comes back and he has a complaint against Deepwater Wind for putting whatever it is in the water. He's Joe Fisherman against Deepwater Wind. That's an unfair balance there. And we were trying to convince everybody to set up a fund administered by the town and Deepwater Wind. And we got every ridiculous reason why this fund couldn't be set up. And we're not trying for rocket science. We're just trying to make it fair to this guy whose net is ripped, and he has to go out and hire a lawyer and bring a lawsuit. And you know, their views, their great phrase was, "Well, this will be decided on a business. This will be determined on a business-to-business basis." Joe Fisherman against the billion-dollar company. I mean, it's like,
I mean, this surely is a solvable problem.
But apropos of your point, it was an important point for individual fishermen that had people been sitting in a room. I cannot believe this point could not have been point 6 of 25 others that would have made.
I completely agree. I mean, in the scheme of things, and let's face it, if it's set up in such a way and you err slightly on the side of the fisherman who ends up getting a little bit more money than might be justified if you had perfect information and perfect facts and all that, so what? I mean, in the scheme of this project, that's pretty trivial. In the scheme of the guy who fishes for a living, it's material.
It's material, right? He's out of business.
And, you know, as a community, I think we need to support the other members of our community. And that's not in contradiction to the objective of making progress on renewable energy. At least I can't see how those two things contradict. And yet somehow we've gotten into this situation where, you know, one group of people gets up and says, you know, if we don't do this project this way and give Deepwater Wind what it wants today, then the planet's going to burn up. And the other side gets up and says, you know, you're not respecting the fact that we earn our living here. You don't think there's going to be any bad consequence. Okay, you don't, but what if there is? What happens to us? We have to be able to solve this problem. And to me, it's a defective political process that we're even kind of sitting here talking about this. So I don't care what the problem is. As you know, anything of consequence in East Hampton is going to be controversial.
Sure.
I mean, we have an articulate activist community. So it's not as if the controversy is just going to evaporate if we suppress it. In fact, that's the opposite. If you suppress controversy, either by doing things behind closed doors in the back room or limiting the opportunities for public participation or by just sort of putting everybody in the position of banging heads, you're not reducing the controversy or solving the problem. You're actually just pouring gas.
Well, you're pouring gas on it, and you're making the divisions between the sides,
Sharper.
and there are always sides.
Yeah, there are going to
Sometimes
be
there are
sides.
3 sides or 4 sides.
Yeah, that's
But,
right. These are real issues,
are-
and people's interests are real concerns to them. When people come before the town board, I have observed over time a tendency for the board to be dismissive if the person who's speaking presents a solution that the board doesn't respect, doesn't think is wise. That's the wrong way to listen. Because what's important is what the person's telling you about their concern and how it affects them. They may or may not have
The perfect solution.
perfect solution. That's not what you've got to hear. What you have to hear is, what's the problem that this person has that needs to be addressed? And if it's not going to be that solution, then it should be a different solution. And the way to get at them is to put the stakeholders in a room in the first instance and say, come out of the room with a solution, or a couple of them. Now, look, they may not get all the way there. It may be that,
David, the Catholics and the Protestants in Ireland somehow got there. So we know this is possible.
Exactly.
They all sat in a room.
yeah, and it took a long time.
Yeah. Well, David, speaking of time, guess what?
We're out of
We're
time.
out of time in about 6 seconds.
Okay, well,
and so
thank you,
I want to thank
Arthur.
you again. Thank you
Pleasure,
for coming
always.
back.
Yeah.
It's an imposition,
I'll
and
come
I
back
appreciate
again.
it. Oh, okay. Well, hopefully we'll see more of you.
Very good.
Think about these problems. And thank you for joining us, and hope you join us for the next in our series.